Mae Brussell, Carmel, California. This is tape number 348, and it's August the 25th, 1978, side 1. We're going to continue on this tape on both sides with an update of the Patty Hearst case since I wrote my article in 1974, and material that I haven't put on the cassettes to share with you since that time. Before I get into that, I just wanted to mention that in the bibliography that I give you, I have up in the corner a suggested title for your tape. And there's a tape on your cassette that is left blank. And write this in. The tape center doesn't have time to get out so many tapes and type this title for each week, and they don't know in advance, of course, what the title is going to be. And some people just get a number like number 342 or 346, whereas I used to be able to type in a single resume like SLA Hearst on the top. So when you get these tapes, take the suggested title that I've put, or if you have a better one, put it on the top of your tape and just do your own work, and it'll be quickly done. There's no reason to not do it this way. You do have the bibliography and source that comes with it each week. Also, when I explained to you last week how Honey was breathing at my feet and sitting right next to me about a few inches away every day, as soon as I talked about it, he got up and left. And it reminded me of the psychic fair I went to a couple of weeks ago when they were talking about ghost houses, and they said, if there's a ghost in the house, you just say, welcome, I know you're here, and I'm sorry I'm intruding because you were here before I came here, but don't mind if we stay here, we won't bother you, and we know you won't bother us. And usually the ghost around there doesn't cause as much problems, and there isn't that friction or anxiety that people get when they don't know how to handle it. And Honey was sitting here at my feet, and I tried that, and as soon as I said on the tape that he's sitting here and he never leaves me, and you'll have to bear with me if he's panting and so forth, he promptly picked himself up and went in the other room and stayed away. And that's the way things go. That's how you have to learn to handle certain matters. I think we have more control over our lives than we think we do, and the world moves in mysterious ways, and whenever I play these very direct kind of honest games with things, they seem to take care of themselves much quicker than if I sit and worry about it. And by next week, my cassette machine should be fixed, and hopefully it will. I think it has a better sound and more clear than this, but we'll limp along with this. And the answer to why all my machinery broke down, the cameras, the copying machine, the typewriter, the 2 tape cassettes, the answer will be found somewhere. If I don't let it perturb me and we work with what we've got, it's smooth sailing, and I'm sure it won't be a continuous thing, and it'll phase away. So we'll just bear with that, and by next week maybe things will be cleared up. If you have any question about tapes, if you're not getting tapes, write to Betty Phillips at the Tape Center and explain which ones you didn't get, and go directly to her so that you can save writing to me, and then I have to call her. And the checks come to my house where I enter them into a book to keep a double record and then send them on to her so that 2 of us can keep track if they're paid. But I don't send any bills, and that's a good way to lose friends and make enemies when you get entangled with money matters. So if there's any question on the billing, I'll send you a running sheet of the way I keep records if you can translate it. And hopefully things are going pretty smoothly and everybody's happy, I hope. Okay, back to the article that was in the Washington Post, because again, the New York Times suppressed this story, and the Washington Post had a long story about Gerald Ford appointing Leo Cherne to his advisory committee. Leo Cherne was head of the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, long associated with the Central Intelligence Agency funds. It's been a CIA front for money, and besides working on the International Rescue Committee, Gerald Ford appointed Leo Cherne to this advisory committee to look over the intelligence community. He appointed him 6 months after Leo Cherne had known contact links with the Patty Hearst case with Randolph Hearst after he lost in Paris a very important book called the Green Book with a list of over 100 intelligence agents. Instead of firing him or passing him up, Gerald Ford promoted him to this very high position in spite of the fact that he had lost a book that endangered the security of the United States. And as I said last week, the book could have such names as Colston Westbrook, Willie Wolfe, Emily William Harris, Angela Atwood, Camille Hall, and various members of the CIA that were the SLA. I call them members of the CIA. We won't know. We never see the book. In the eyes of national security, we're not going to know. But the recipient of this little book that was lost in Paris in March 1975, as I said last week, was Michael James Casey, who picked it up in Hong Kong and or in Bangkok or South Vietnam. He won't say which of those three places. He was in all three in July of 1975. So from March to July, the book ended up in Southeast Asia in the hands of Michael Casey, who then took it to San Diego. And Michael Casey, as I said, was an ex-convict from Soledad. He had spent 2 years there on forgery charges, but he had been in Boys Town, Nebraska, where he did another thing which makes him terribly important. He took a list of files from them. It was a scandal that he took this list of files from Boys Town, and then he was hired by Leo Cherne later to work for the International Rescue Committee, the CIA front. Casey has been linked to Phoenix agents of the Southeast Asian CIA operation, as I said, down at Camp Pendleton and with Premier Key and so forth. And he was also in touch with Judge Carter at the time of Patty Hearst's sentencing. Now, Emily William Harris had been charged with bank robbery after they were arrested, and it was a long time, another year before they were even charged with the arrest of Patty Hearst. Judge Carter died before Patty Hearst was sentenced, and he had been sent to a hospital for a mental analysis. There was a book that came out on federal judges and the control and the stupidity of them, and they described one Judge Carter in San Francisco who had mental breakdowns and was taken to a mental hospital and was literally mentally a zombie at times. That's what this book came out and stated. And Judge Carter dropped dead before Patty was sentenced. Now, the pressure of what Michael Casey told him or was corresponding with him about Patty Hearst might have been too much, and whatever it was, he isn't the first judge on an intelligence case who dies quickly just at the crucial sentencing time. Judge Battle died when he was hearing James Earl Ray's case, and he dropped over dead, and James Earl Ray was pronounced guilty, and now James Earl Ray is testifying before the House Select Committee that he didn't kill Martin Luther King. James Earl Ray had another hearing in Cincinnati on the case. It was moved to Cincinnati, Judge Miller, and Judge Miller was favorable to James Earl Ray having another trial, and Judge Miller died on the bench. A judge in the Alioto case, the mayor of San Francisco, had a case against Look magazine alleging that he was linked to organized crime. The judge up in Seattle dropped dead on the case. Well, the Washington Post had this long story. The New York Times didn't write anything about the links of the SLA. The Washington Post wrote about Judge Carter, the links of Michael Casey to Judge Carter, the links of Michael Casey to Randolph Hearst, and his interest in the SLA and the Phoenix program. The New York Times, the same date for the same article, had a headline, U.S. Investigating Loss of Notebook Containing National Security Data by Nicholas Hurok, the man who also writes about the Kennedy assassination and suppresses that evidence. But nowhere in the New York Times article did he mention any link of Michael Casey and to Randolph Hearst or Patricia Hearst or the CIA links in that little notebook. That was excluded. The Associated Press, United Press, Reuters, Earth News, Zodiac News, CBS, NBC, all the major media had nothing really about Leo Cherne and his little green book and the links again to the SLA and the CIA. The only mention of these connecting links was actually by Lawrence Stern in the Washington Post. And he wrote about the links of it says that Michael Casey, a 32-year-old Californian who prides his work in the resettlement of the Vietnamese refugees, those are the Phoenix agents, sought to appear as a witness in behalf of Patty Hearst at her trial in charge of the bank robbery. And he wound up in an ironic turn instead working for the International Rescue Committee, of which Leo Cherne was chairman of the board. So Michael Casey had wanted to testify for Patty Hearst, and of course you probably never heard his name until you received this tape, but he wasn't allowed to be at her trial at all. Not only was he director of Boys Town, but when he was fired over the 31 files that he took, they were allegedly for MGM television. And Ken Reitz, I don't know if there's any connection or not, the man from the counterintelligence operations in the White House at the time of Watergate, went on to work for MGM, and he's now managing the political campaign of Evelle Younger for governor in California. So everywhere this story, the Associated Press, United Press, Reuters, all of them, suppressed the story, and the Washington Post covered it. They said the Green Book is a government notepad that contains diplomatic and intelligence officers, and they told how it was lost in 1975. It has classified information. Leo Cherne had CIA connections with President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and also with his International Rescue Committee. He traveled with his aide, Commander Lionel Ulmer, who in 19 years with a Navy career of intelligence was always extremely meticulous. He was professional and experienced in handling classified material. Now, this is an interesting thing. I believe that in 1974, when I wrote the article, the SLA is the CIA, I called attention to the fact that Emily Harris had in her notebook the name of a Tim Casey in Orange County. And I wrote that in July 1974 about that, because when the 6 people were burned in Los Angeles by the Los Angeles SWAT team, Emily and William Harris took Patty Hearst to an apartment in Orange County outside of Disneyland. The 1974 shootout took place. Patty was driven by Emily and William Harris, and they end up in Disneyland a year later in 1974 at the time of the shootout in Oakland. Emily Harris had in her apartment, or when they were arrested for kidnapping Patty, the name of Tim Casey in Orange County. And Emily Harris knew a Casey out in Disneyland from 1973 to 74. This is just prior to Patty's kidnapping. She had worked at Disneyland. And Disneyland, of course, was the home of Ron Ziegler, who worked for Richard Nixon, the press secretary. He had worked in the jungle rides, and the accounts, the public relation firm of J. Walter Thompson, has been a conduit of CIA agents through the Mullen offices in Washington, D.C., and through the Mormon Church. And J. Walter Thompson also carried the Disneyland account. So that down in Disneyland in the summer before Emily Harris had gone up to the Bay Area, this college graduate with all this education and so forth, to kidnap Patty Hearst, she knew a Tim Casey in Disneyland, and I called attention to it in my article in 74. And then in 75, a Michael Casey comes out who works for the CIA and lives in the San Diego area. And then in 1976, it comes out that Michael Casey has the book of ages listed by Leo Cherne. As I say, I wrote in the SLA article in 74, when the Harris's apartment was vacated in the Oakland area, after Patty was kidnapped, among the names left was an address book of Tim Casey from Orange County. Emily dated him during the summer of 67 and 68 while she worked at the Disneyland Hotel in California. Disneyland was the location of Ronald Ziegler to become press secretary for President Nixon. Disneyland Hotel and the San Francisco Police Department both used J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, the same agency that gave us Robert Haldeman, Dwight Chapin, Richard Nixon's White House plumber chiefs. Was Emily Harris in touch with espionage agents from Orange County? Now, nobody has confirmed that Tim and Michael Casey are the same or brothers or relatives, but nobody has denied it because nobody has looked into it. And yet, in 1975, Michael Casey surfaces and comes home in 76, or calls the authorities, and it's exposed in 76 that he, in fact, did get a book of these 100 agents from Leo Cherne while in Europe. Another Tim Casey, I don't know if it's the same one Emily Harris dated or not, or probably not, San Francisco police officer, was the person to bring in Patty Hearst and Wendy Yoshimura as I said last week on the tape, 3 weeks to the day that I said on the air that Patty Hearst would be brought in, and had written to Randolph Hearst, a Tim Casey went to the apartment. And Mr. Bates, Charles Bates, said on the TV, we didn't know where Patty was, but a Tim Casey from the San Francisco Police Department went there. And the AP story at the time of September 20th, or September 20, 1975, said police officer Tim Casey and FBI agent Tom Padden were seen by Wendy Yoshimura through a window in the door of their apartment on Moore Street that was owned by a member of the San Francisco Police Department. Yoshimura opened the door. Hearst said, "Don't shoot, I'll go with you." And that ended the 592-day search of looking for Patty Hearst. Now, this book, this little green book, was discovered to be missing immediately after their arrival in the United States of Leo Cherne and his Navy associate. He went to his Rockville, Maryland home, and he called Wheaton Byers, executive secretary of the Foreign Intelligence Board, and said, "I've lost my notebook, it's missing." Then the headlines came out in 1975, "Mystery Solved, Little Green Book Located." This is July 24th, 1975. But the mystery was hardly solved because of the transference of hands. Rather, 1976, the article came out, "The Mystery Solved, the Little Green Book Located." And it turns out that Michael James Casey from Los Angeles called Leo Cherne and said, "I have your notebook." Now, I think with his links to the Southeast Asian Phoenix program, the CIA, Boys Town, and Time Magazine, and NBC, and he goes to Asia and comes home with a book that was lost in Paris, I don't see where the mystery is solved at all, particularly since he's asking to testify at the Patty Hearst trial. And he has this information about Patty Hearst, and he's in charge with Judge Carter. Casey's explanation for receiving the book from Hong Kong, according to the Washington Post article, was that I got the book from sympathizers of Patty Hearst. And then he said that's how it was returned to him by sympathizers for Patty Hearst. Well, where are these sympathizers? Whose names are in the book? They certainly weren't at her trial in San Francisco. And when the name Hearst came into this, the major media didn't cover it, only the Washington Post. And the same man, as I say, who took these 31 files from Boys Town, who was acquitted of felonious entry into the Boys Town, then went on to be hired by Leo Cherne after this for the International Rescue Committee. Michael Casey said about the little green book that it was to help Patty, but as I say, I don't know how it did it, and I don't want to make it too confusing for you, except that the transference of the book, the death of Judge Carter, the silence of the media, and the similarity of the cases, one in San Diego, one in Orange County, makes it imperative to untangle this can of worms. August 26, 1975, when his notebook was returned, it was turned over to the intelligence staff, and 3 weeks later, Michael Casey, who worked for Leo Cherne in the International Rescue Committee, was asked to resign from the International Rescue Committee. So Leo Cherne had hired Casey, and Michael Casey did work for him. Now, April, May, and June, Casey said that he was working for Cherne's organization and the CIA, and he used the credentials of Time Magazine to get over to Asia, and then he gets back. September 22nd, 1975, was the date that Michael Casey was in contact with Judge Carter, and he sent a telegram to him under the name of the International Rescue Committee, which was a CIA organization, and he asked them, Judge Carter then, that Patty Hearst be given bail, and then Judge Carter passed away, and a new judge went on to the case shortly afterwards. After Cherne lost his notebook, as I say, he was appointed and promoted instead of demoted to President Ford's extra sensitive Foreign Intelligence and Advisory Board. The question remains in all of this, how did Tim Casey in Southeast Asia get a hold of this list of agents that was lost in Europe. What names were on the list? Why was he in touch with Judge Carter? Why was he employed by Leo Cherne of the Central Intelligence Agency? And how can we solve this particular Patty Hearst SLA CIA kidnapping without finding out if Emily Harris was dating a Michael Casey who was the same as Tim or a blood relative of Casey's down in Orange County? I think the clue of how they escaped the fire in Los Angeles the night before all the SLA members were burned, Emily and William Harris took Patty in a car and they went to see a drive-in movie and had dinner, and they didn't go back and tell the others that they had left a van with their address in it, and the others were all killed. And then they had Patty located at a hotel in Disneyland where, by the evening news and the burning of the SLA, she saw it on television. And that's a very important part of Patty Hearst's mind control, is that she viewed all of them being killed, and they kept telling her that your family doesn't know if you're inside or not, and everybody is letting you die. You're meaningless. You don't mean anything to them. We're the only ones you can trust. You'll stay with us. And after seeing them all killed, she didn't know at the time, Patty didn't know, that the police department had dogs that had sniffed her clothes and were familiar with her odors. And I saw the movies that Lake Headley has of the dogs going up to the cottage before the shootout and sniffing around and going away, and they're sitting on the sidewalk out there watching the house burn where the 6 people are inside, and he's not frantic at all. The dog knows that she isn't inside, but Patty doesn't know that. And how did they get her to a hotel in Disneyland, such a straight environment? Emily William Harris took her there. Emily was familiar with Disneyland. She had been there, and they had Patty sitting and watching TV, which is kind of a funny thing to be doing at this particular hour. You think they'd be fleeing the area. But they were watching television, and then Patty's mind was locked in the scene of that fire with what they said to her. She could be mesmerized or drugged or just told absolutely, see, nobody cares about you. For all purposes, you're dead. This is what the FBI does. This is what the police do. And Evelle Bailey let admission come into the trial of things that happened after the robbery of the Hibernia Bank. But he didn't admit any investigation of the Harrises, of Casey's, and Leo Cherne, or the list of agents, to the fact that Patricia Hearst had indeed not only been picked up and kept in a closet for 54 days and handcuffed and in a dark room and terrorized and filled with guilt, but the terrorizing continued down in the Los Angeles area with the Harrises in control of Patty Hearst. She hated them, and instinctively people get certain vibes about others that they're with, and she had nothing to go on to know who Emily and William Harris were, but she hated being with them, she said later. I said on the tape last week that Donald DeFreeze was killed by bullets close up. The first story was that he committed suicide, and then in May of 1975, there was a United Press article, Sin Q, that was the name given to Donald DeFreeze in Vacaville, didn't kill himself. It's got consultants laid on the police, Dr. Ronald Taylor, director of the forensic laboratory in the coroner's office, and Dr. Vincent Gwynn, a chemistry professor at UC Irvine and a scientific consultant, claimed that the analyzers of the ballistic test do not bear out Thomas Noguchi's conclusion that Donald DeFreeze killed himself. Our data doesn't support suicide. They support homicide. They didn't prove it, but it looks to us like DeFreeze was killed with a nickel-plated, steel-jacketed bullet. They said it was a .38 caliber revolver that was found under Donald DeFreeze with copper-jacketed bullets. But they said we have additional information that very likely at least one member of the Los Angeles Police Department SWAT team may have fired a different kind of ammunition than we received in the initial samples. This was non-regulation ammunition, allegedly, and was supposedly of World War II surplus of ammunition of foreign manufacture, steel jacket, rather than a copper jacket. Now, if they have a single person, different than the SWAT team, with a different kind of ammunition and bullet, was that, in fact, the Don Gray that was described by Mr. Lewis, who shot Donald DeFreeze at close range, and it was not the SWAT department of the Los Angeles Police Department from the front. They burst fire into the house, but there were different kinds of bullets, and they claimed that one person had fired from a different kind of a bullet that had killed Donald DeFreeze. This information came out May 23, 1975. My article, July 1974, said that Donald DeFreeze was killed at close range by a man in a sweatshirt running down the alley from in back of the house. One of the big mysteries of the SLA story is the book Black Abductor that I wrote about in 1974. It was published in San Diego. That's the home of Mickey and Jack Scott. That's where they were at the time that they were arrested. They weren't arrested. They were recognized for having taken Patty from the Bay Area to Pennsylvania and then back to the Bay Area. The book was published by Regency Publisher, a non-existent publisher, and the author was Harrison James, who to this day has never come forward to claim his miraculous writing of this book in 1972 when Patty wasn't kidnapped until 1974. Of course, the CIA used book publishers and pornographers, and they had a book publishing company run by Robert Mayhew in San Diego, simulated pictures of Sukarno they were making, saying that he was chasing around with different women, and the CIA has gotten out books in advance of actions or afterwards that were published by their non-existent publishers. They're not for ordinary people from off the street. I will read you briefly from my notes I have from the book Black Abductor what the book says, the first line, and then what actually happened in the case of Patty Hearst to show the similarity. The heroine in each book was called Patricia. They both Patricias from wealthy conservative families. In the book, she went from Cornell University. In real life, Patty went to Cal University in Berkeley. Both women were kidnapped at night near the campus. Both of them were dragged out half naked. In each case, in the book and in real life, the boyfriend was beaten. Stephen Weed was beat up in this case. The abductors were multiracial, a black man with white women. They were described as a ragtag group of ideologues of mixed sexes. The boyfriend was a suspect in the book, and he is a suspect in real life. The leader of the group that kidnapped the Patricia was an embittered black man in the book and described as embittered black man in real life. The abductors used Polaroid pictures of the victim to send their messages in the book, Black Abductor, and 2 years later they used a Polaroid picture to take messages to pass on. It was called America's First Political Kidnapping in the book, and Patty Hearst kidnapping was called America's First Political Kidnapping. Discounting the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, this was to escalate not individual violence, but the great terrorism that we see all over the world, and hopefully to link it to international terrorism around the world. In the book, it was modeled after Latin American terrorists, and in real life, it was modeled after Latin American terrorists, and they took the name of Tanya, the dead woman that died when Che Guevara was killed. One woman in the group was lesbian, or more lesbian than the others, and in the SLA group, Ms. Moon and Camila Hall were the two lesbians that were incorporated. The book was described as a fictional precursor, but the law of probability of these things happening is just, according to some experts, too great to calculate, and it seems that somebody knew a lot about what was to take place in 1974. And if Charlie Bates was brought out through the Tom Charles Houston plan to the area in San Francisco in 72, then all the groundwork was being laid for this operation. It's also interesting to note that in the article I wrote in 1974, I went in great length that this was a Tom Charles Houston COINTEL operation directed from the Pentagon and the White House. And it later came out at the time Spiro Agnew became president of a foundation in Bloomington, Indiana, that it was the place where Emily William Harris and Angela and Gary Atwood had attended in Bloomington, Indiana. And the lawyer who wrote the rules and bylaws for the foundation that Spiro Agnew is now president of is Tom Charles Houston, who was working in the White House with Richard Nixon and Navy and Army Intelligence and Defense Intelligence Agency and the FBI. The same Tom Charles Houston whose operation I described in the SLA as the CIA was the lawyer for the foundation in Bloomington, Indiana, where the Harrises and Atwoods came from, and Spiro Agnew now works there with the oil people from the Middle East. More about the CIA and the SLA on the next side of this tape. Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 349, side 2, August the 25th, 1978. Angry and disgusted at the way the Patty Hearst case is going. I think I could do the next 20-week tapes on new evidence of the Patty Hearst story since I wrote my article in 1974. But we'll talk about the case on this side of this tape, and next week, hopefully, I'll do an hour on Evelle Younger. Evelle Younger, he's the gentleman that's running for the governor of the state of California, who's set up the Office of Criminal Conspiracy Section in the Los Angeles Police Department, and it was in the Criminal Conspiracy Section that Donald DeFreeze worked along with Louis Tackwood. And he's running for governor, and he had a very important part in the SLA and in the California violence, and it's a good continuation to go into Evelle Younger at this time. Eric Younger, the son of Evelle Younger, was on the courts in Los Angeles when the Harrises had their trial down there, and he's so much a part of the counterintelligence of the right-wing terror that has taken over this country, and particularly this state. I understand that F. Lee Bailey has been threatening blackmail Patty, tell more, break a client-lawyer relationship. Partly I get frustrated because the Hearst never got in touch with me in the 4 years that I've done all this work, and I've published articles in the Bay Area and been on the radio many, many times. But again, in all fairness, KGO radio has never allowed me to talk about Evelle Younger or Patty Hearst. I can talk about the Kennedy assassination or Watergate, but I've been blacklisted from various radio announcers there, and I was told once that Evelle Younger had actually been at the building. His office is across the street, the federal building, and Charlie Bates of the FBI was always in contact with the various people at KGO, Ron Owen and Owen Spann and Jim Eason and the whole gang. And it's very hard in the Bay Area. There's some word out from the intelligence community or whatever, I don't know how it passes through, that all the links of the CIA to the kidnapping of Patty Hearst are not about to be disseminated. And the only hope would be that her parents would help cooperate with this information, but the fact is that Randolph Hearst works now with a private think tank group, a very arch-conservative group from Stanford Research, and has never gone into the links of the scientists from Stanford Research that had anything to do with the kidnapping of his own daughter. It's just impossible to get through these people. The Harrises keep asking for that mental test that Patty have. The victim of a kidnapping should be given a mental test when she's sounding more sane than she's ever been is just outrageous. And of course they have delayed their trial again. They'll keep stalling and installing their trial, the Harrises, the kidnappers, until Patty is either dead or crazy, and then there won't be anyone left to prosecute them. And Stephen Weed was in the apartment when they came and took Patty. Why don't they let him testify? Do they ask him for a mental test, or is he just taking a powder and he's anonymous? Well, on the other side of this tape, I talked about Leo Cherne and that little green book of his of spies and his being on the International Rescue Committee. There's an article about him in February 1976. This was after he lost his little book, in the New York Times, when he was appointed to this new CIA committee to investigate, quotes, abuses of the CIA in the United States. And Leo Cherne was described in this article as belonging to a very private humanitarian organization that received some 15,000 that they knew about from the CIA in his International Rescue Committee in the mid-60s. And Cherne denied that his International Rescue Committee knew that the money was coming from the CIA. But Mr. Frank Wild, president of the International Rescue Committee, said that a mysterious man came to them in 1963 or 64 and passed $15,000 through the Norman Foundation from the CIA to the Rescue Committee. This Rescue Committee is supposed to be one of Leo Cherne's hobbies, and he has raised over $3 million a year for the committee. He's an economist who is associated with the Citizens Committee for Free Cuba, part of the anti-Castro Cuban group of the Central Intelligence Agency, and a council against communist aggression. He's chairman of Freedom House, a rescue group that monitors and reports about other countries in the world, and Freedom House receives money from the CIA Foundation, the J.J. Kaplan Fund. And also Mr. Cherne wrote a book in 1942 called Adjusting Your Business to War. I'm sure that's very practical, and he would know about that. In May of 1963, just a few months before John Kennedy was killed, there was a conference in New York City of Freedom House, and a new group was formed, that group called Citizens Committee for Free Cuba. And he not only was interested in freeing Cuba, but worked with the Vietnamese CIA agents that came into this country through his International Rescue Committee, and worked closely with the China lobby and other members of the American Security Council, such as Claire Booth Luce of Time magazine, and also, as I said, on the other side of the tape, and the other tape, that Michael Casey went to Southeast Asia under the press passport of Time magazine and came home with Leo Cherne's book and of spies, and had used it in some way in contact with Judge Carter at the time of the Patty Hearst case. In a book put out on the Hudson Institute, the Herman Kahn, he's the director of this Hudson Institute. He worked with Rand Corporation and Northrop Aviation and Stanford Research Institute, Herman Kahn, and one of the directors of the Hudson Institute is Leo Cherne, Research Institute of America and Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Now, Herman Kahn not only is head of the Hudson Institute that advises the Pentagon and all defense agencies and has Leo Cherne on his board of directors, but in keeping with the article that I wrote, The SLA is the CIA, here's a quotation of Herman Kahn in 1976 talking to the police convention in Los Angeles. Now, keep in mind that Ed Davis, head of the international police from all over the world, had a convention, and the guest speaker was this Herman Kahn, who was associated with Leo Cherne. And it was the Los Angeles Police Department that also had employed Donald DeFreeze. This is what Herman Kahn said at the meeting. It was in the Los Angeles Times, in quote, "A change is taking place after dominance for the past decades of Eastern liberals, transcendentalists, Jews, Episcopals, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quaker, Unitarians. These liberals did their best to wreck the country by embracing a set of values that did little to solve the country's problems. These values included emphasis on risk aversion, comfort, safety, health, ecology and environment, social justice, welfare, security, the quality of life, happiness, and hedonism. I would argue there's nothing wrong with these values, but you can't run a country on them. We are now going to a conservative turn. Square values, square politics. This is the year of very square. The country is basically conservative." Now, that is Herman Kahn from the Hudson Institute, who works with Leo Cherne, whose list of agents fell in the hand of Michael Casey, who was dealing with Judge Carter at the time of Patty's trial. And that's what the SLA COINTEL operation was about. The Operation Chaos was to get all those groups in the Bay Area in San Francisco, the farmers, the Venceremos, the Chicanos, the women's movements, the United Farm Workers, the United Prisoners Workers, the Indian movement, single out the leaders, identify them, infiltrate them, discredit the Berkeley anti-war protesters, and those people working for, as he says, equality, ecology, environment, and social justice. They closed the department at Berkeley, I forget, the criminal department that was fairly liberal in studying criminal justice. And these are the kinds of people from the Pentagon who are changing our domestic policy radically, and they needed the SLA and the Los Angeles Police Department and the SWAT teams to create this, foment this body in the prison system. Patty was just a pawn, like you play a chess game. She was just used as a pawn in these maneuvers for them to come down on the youth and bust in, as I say, into communes and harass and arrest. It's a complicated social structure, but everyone on the fringe of this and in the middle of it is linked to the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI. That's what I wrote in 1974, and this is Herman Kahn speaking in 1976, and Leo Cherne working with Michael Casey in 1975 and 1976. There's an attorney for radicals that I absolutely detest, almost as much as Mark Lane. His name is William Kunstler. I don't trust him. I never have. Kunstler was invited to a devout Baptist meeting in Dallas, Texas, and I keep quoting this, and he said he couldn't fire the gun himself, but it's a good thing John Kennedy was killed because he should be killed. He was a menace to this country. Well, Kunstler goes around with these so-called radicals that always end up straight or end up in jail. He defended the Chicago 7, and Sherman Skolnick, whom I respect tremendously, has broken down the sources of almost every person in the Chicago 7 trial as being agent provocateurs. He went on to Wounded Knee. He hasn't helped the Indians much since. He shows up at a few trials of blacks, a black woman in the South that escaped from jail. He was down there with her. He's with the Indians, but social changes don't come about through William Kunstler, and the defendants still seem to end up in jail or just as badly off. I don't know what his liberalism, if it's liberal, is really doing, and I suspect him of being a deep cover fascist. I don't think there's a liberal bone in Kunstler. Now, some of you won't like that remark of mine, but that I've observed him for years, I've heard him, and I really consider him an enemy to the truth that I'm trying to open up. And Kunstler was in Los Angeles representing Emily and William Harris, not as their attorney, but for Leonard Weinglass to raise money for their trial. And he was lashing out at Patty Hearst and saying that people won't give Harris a fair break, that the Hearsts have all the rights, and that because she's a Hearst, that Emily and William Harris just won't get a chance in this system. He said the Harris' chance for justice under the American judicial system has been aborted by the Hearst connection and the orgy of mass media coverage, the SLA syndrome. Now, the SLA demanded that all their messages be read on the radio or Patty would be killed. They demanded that they get national coverage, that these messages be printed. They demanded the use of the media. They took the daughter and granddaughter of one of California's most famous families and got all this massive publicity and then claimed that this is an orgy of mass media. To take a college student like that and kidnap her and then have her stand in front of cameras with machine guns and leave these messages at radio stations and in boxes and demand they be printed and spoken on the air. And Kunstler came out and questioned the legal system of justice in America as against what Patty Hearst gets. And he never goes into the fact that a person was kidnapped. It doesn't matter whether Patty is the richest girl in America or the poorest girl. She should be given the same consideration if she was kidnapped. And then Kunstler went on to say that Charles Manson and Lynette and Squeaky Fromm were simply victims of hysteria, that Manson was actually insane, and that Squeaky Fromm didn't have a fair trial. There was suppression of evidence in the Fromm trial, enough to declare a mistrial for Fromm if she hadn't been a Manson girl. Well, the fact that she stood inches away from Gerald Ford and pulled out a gun, she didn't have a double. That was Squeaky Fromm, although there are many doubles around. And she wore that bright red hood. She was so conspicuous, like a Red Riding Hood, and pulls a gun out in front of the President of the United States after we've had one assassination and one accident at Chappaquiddick, and George Wallace was shot at the Maryland Shopping Center. And he says she couldn't have a fair trial. I don't know what Kunstler wanted or why he's taking this side of Manson and Fromm and Emily and William Harris, because it's through Squeaky Fromm and the CIA that I feel that Patty's life is in danger. So I watched Kunstler, and time and time again his statements really are nauseating to me, but they're even more than that. His defending Squeaky and the Mansons and saying that they're really nothing but hysteria. I don't understand. The Manson family created corpses down in Los Angeles, you know, 6 in one home and 2 in another, a woman pregnant screaming for her life, and other bodies buried on the ranch of the Manson family. And to be associated with them is plenty, and to be part of all those murders and blood is plenty, and Nazi swastikas, you know, carved into their foreheads. And Kunstler is saying that Squeaky Fromm is just a victim of hysteria. We don't have many overt, violent women like that walking around, and I don't know where the hysteria is. Nobody put her in the park in front of Gerald Ford, or if they did, she's a victim of that. But then go into that. No one was out to get her blood or guts. She had the gun in her leg. She pulled it out, and she missed, but she tried to shoot. She wasn't a victim of hysteria. She was a victim of her acts. And why is William Kunstler defending Emily and William Harris and Squeaky Fromm at this time? I'd really like to know that. Another sad part of the SLA story that is never gotten into is Walter Scott. August the 18th, 1975, this was 3 years ago, an article in the San Francisco Chronicle saying a curious piece of the Patty Hearst puzzle came several weeks ago. It came through the father, John Scott, 66-year-old, and Jack Scott, 33, his wife, Mickey, and their brother, Walter, 42, who's an ex-Marine. The curious episode still puzzles the authorities because an anonymous informer called Scranton, Pennsylvania police and said the SLA fugitives were in a house near Scranton. 3 days later, the FBI went into a farmhouse where Jack and Mickey Scott had taken Patty Hearst. The FBI disclosed that the Scranton informer had been Walter Scott, and the FBI immediately began looking for Jack Scott and his wife Mickey. Walter Scott, who called the police on the tip-off where Patty Hearst was staying, and then remember that's the summer when the FBI had increased their numbers to thousands and were breaking into every van and every Volkswagen, every commune, allegedly looking for Patty with black wigs, braids, short hair, long hair. The chase ended in Pennsylvania in that summer, and then Walter Scott went into the protective custody of the FBI and told damning stories about his father, John, and his brother, Jack, and they put him in a mental institution. The San Francisco Chronicle said Walter Scott was a computer specialist. He worked for Washington firms with government contracts, the father explained. He was twice divorced, a paid informant for the FBI, and various U.S. intelligence agencies. Well, what happened to Walter Scott August 18, 1975? Mickey and Jack Scott were later located, but they have never been charged with taking Patricia Hearst to Pennsylvania and back and costing the taxpayers about $3 million in extra agents that summer. But pretty soon, in November of 75, there's an article that shortly after that Walter Scott is suicidal, and that in Las Vegas, they lived in Las Vegas where Patty had been taken before they went to Pennsylvania. He was taken to the South Nevada Memorial Hospital after the police were called, and he was put in the mental department. The story was that he was suicidal or that he was shooting out at the swimming pool, and pictures of his brother and his wife, and they put him in a psychiatric ward for observation. And in the apartment were a lot of memorabilia of the Patty Hearst case, and they were scattered all over the place. Walter Scott was put in there for mental observation in November 1975, and it'll be 3 years later in another month or two. And I take 10 papers a day I never yet have read about Walter Scott or where he is today. Maybe fill up my file and find out, or write to the FBI. Remember the famous Dita Beard in 1972, of April 72, who had an ITT memo that Jack Anderson broke that about the ITT putting up hotels and giving $400,000 to Richard Nixon's campaign in San Diego in exchange for using their hotels for the convention. Well, Dita Beard was taken to a hospital in Colorado, and flowers sent by the President of the United States. The carnations had bugs in them and wiretaps, and an agent was sent to court the daughter and see their son and her son. And there were photographs of her with tubes in her nose in this particular hospital. Where is Dita Beard today? Martha Mitchell was taken, injected in California, we were told that she was discredited or drunk or silly, and a few years later she died of a miserable cancer where her bones all dissolved. Does Walter Scott have cancer yet, like Jack Ruby and Martha Mitchell? Has he had a lobotomy? Certainly his brother and sister-in-law never were bothered by the police department on this case. Now, he claimed also, besides being a military intelligence, that he was a hitman for the CIA. He worked as a hitman for the National Security Agency, not the CIA. The agency that recently a law was passed, nobody can be prosecuted who works for the National Security Agency. And he said he had been in Egypt, and he did contracts for killing. This is the Earth News story, October 3rd, 1975. I get paid for killing people, and I get them good. I've been doing it for 8 years, and I'm still alive. I recently killed 3 people in a hotel room in Cairo. Well, that's enough to get Walter Scott killed, for sure, and push him over the deep end. Also, at the time of the Patty Hearst story, when the Harrises had Patty Hearst, there was an article in the San Francisco paper, a Harris inventory, they got a tax refund. They had kidnapped Patty, and she was in there in the custody of the Harrises, but the United States Treasury Department had sent a rebate of $146.80 to the Harrises, and the FBI refused to indicate who received the refund check. I have just 10, 20, 30 articles here. I'll run down some of the points as fast as I can on the SLA that came out in the news that I have never discussed on these tapes with you, but are in my files. One was the house where Patty was picked up with Wendy Yoshimura, I mentioned briefly on the other side. 625 Moore Street was owned by Raymond Ray. 20 years work with the San Francisco Police Department, Bureau of Identifications. And when they asked about him, and they'd rent the apartment, he said in quotes, "I guess I lost my cop's eye, and as an ex-police officer, I'm dumbfounded that he rented it to Patty Hearst and Wendy Yoshimura, and they were living in a house owned by the San Francisco Police Department, Bureau of Identification, Mr. Raymond Ray." The house was also a safe house. The owner of the apartment where they were arrested 4.5 months later wasn't even rented. There's a safe house at the end of the street here where I live, at the end of the cul-de-sac. I'm very familiar with them. They stay empty, and then a family moves in, and they don't fix the yard or the house or paint or put anything on the walls, and they just simply stay there until they get an assignment, and then they move out and somebody else moves in. This house was empty, and it wasn't fixed up. The rent would be $180 monthly rent, but at the time the investigation came out that this police agent owned the house still wasn't rented. Comparison could be made to Lee and Marina Oswald living on Neely Street in Dallas, Texas, and an agent upstairs who moved in the same date as Lee Harvey Oswald and moved out the same week, who worked in the intelligence operation with Lee Oswald. They both moved out the same week. It was a duplex, and after they moved out, the apartment was never rented after April 63. When John Kennedy was assassinated in November 63, people went to the building. The only one who had access to the building was the FBI or the police department. And it was in that house in the backyard where these pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly were taken, but where the body of somebody could be standing out in the yard and then the head superimposed like Oswald said it was, because nobody used the property. Some people must be very rich, and they don't need their income property after these agents live there, or else it is used as a safe house. Mickey and Jack Scott, the two people that took Patty, were going to be investigated by the grand jury into possible harboring of fugitives. So Jack Scott had a press conference and pronounced that they were being harassed by the FBI, and no indictments, of course, ever came down against the Scotts. All they got was a new book published. They've been touring and giving lectures and interviews on a book that they got published. They're called activists, sports activist writers, who had their own foundation before the Patty Hearst story and are immune from being arrested. And I think through the court system of the SLA even, you can see the comparisons to Nazi Germany, where all the people involved that ordinarily would be in jail 4 years, it wouldn't take 4 years to get the Harrises charged with kidnapping. Wendy Yoshimura is still out. Stephen Celaya, who helped get the apartment in San Francisco where Patty was arrested with Wendy Yoshimura, perjured himself in Sacramento at the time of the Carmichael Bank case. Stephen Celaya had a double. His father worked with the FBI and tipped off where they were. He was let off of the case completely, and so were all the other people, even though a murder was involved. Robin Steiner was identified as a CIA agent by Donald DeFreeze just before he was killed. She'd come to California with Russell Little from Florida. She went back to Florida. She never was called before any California grand jury or investigated about her links with Russell Little when they went from Florida to Pennsylvania. That not only was the state where the safe house was, where Patty Hearst was kept after she left California, but it was the state that Colston Westbrook came from and Willie Wolfe came from and many other intelligence people. But Robin Steiner came out here with Russell Little and never came back after all the deaths and the trials to be a witness. James Browning, the prosecutor of the Patty Hearst case, was just dying to get this case. He had said in the newspaper, "This is the one case I want to get." The San Francisco Chronicle had an interview with him in January 1976. He was vice president of Young Republicans, California Young Republicans. Charles Watson had worked with them and various other agent provocateurs in that group. Watson was the man in the Manson family that actually did the killings in the house. He was a federal employee. He worked for Republican causes. He worked in a crusade to fight the Vietnam draft resistors. And then, of course, all the people against Patty were down bringing these refugees, Vietnam War people, back into this country. He was handling civil rights complaints and welfare cheaters and monitoring what he called terrorist activities. He was concerned, like Richard Nixon was, he said, with the New Left. He went to special meetings of the criminal investigation in 1970. That's when the FBI COINTEL program and the CIA Operation Chaos could be getting the groundwork to get those people who, from 67, 68, 69, the hippies, the dropouts, the anti-war people, the Berkeley free speech movement, the Black Panther movement, the United Prisoners Union, Venceremos, the United Farm Workers. Those were the people that had to be slammed down and infiltrated. He worked with Nixon, as I said. He was worried about the New Left because they were critical of those crooks in the White House, and he refused to prosecute that narcotic agent that went up to Humboldt County and shot down this young fellow in his home. The helicopters landed. They shot him on a false raid and left, and James Browning wouldn't prosecute that case. And he ended the Indian occupation of Alcatraz. The Indians wanted as a symbol of something they could hold on to. It's not that great, and it's pretty windy, and it's a tourist trap. But he cleaned the Indians out of there, and Mr. Oakes, the Indian that was holding the island there as a symbol of the Indians even holding on to any little piece of rock, was murdered, and the people that murdered him got off, and D.A. Browning, I don't know if it was in his area or not, he had kicked the Indians out of Alcatraz, and Oakes was murdered, hit on the head with a cue stick, and had brain injuries. And then in another area later, he died from a outright attack that killed him. He survived the first surgery. Browning was a major in the Air Force Reserve until 1972, and of course, Evelle Younger is a general in the Air Force Reserve. And I just wonder if the Young Republicans and their Air Force work and their counterintelligence operation against the New Left and the criminal conspiracy section, how briefed Mr. D.A. Browning was to handle these cases. He also threatened the Berkeley City Council in November 71 if they passed sanctuaries for Vietnam deserters. So you have a very political, right-wing, fascist group against the kids, against the Indians, against the left, against the hippies on the commune, not prosecuting for cases of murder, but going out after Patty and not prosecuting the Harrises for 4 years. There's just so much on the SLA. As I say, it's been 4 years since I wrote The SLA is the CIA, but I think from these last two tapes on both sides, you get the idea that I still believe what I wrote in 74, even more so, and I would like to someday get a publisher and do the first story and then the follow-ups of it to keep you up on this. The story of Stephen Celaya has never really been told. He harbored Patty Hearst, too. He called it love, not politics, in the Washington Post, but he was never charged with getting an apartment and moving them from Sacramento into the San Francisco area. Everyone around Patty was danger, and they're all immune from prosecution. And Wendy Yoshimura was given money by right-wing groups in the Japanese community, and her art was sold to the federal building, and she's still not in jail, and she kept the apartment where Patty was until they were arrested. We'll go to Evelle Younger, and then maybe I will get back to more to Patty Hearst because the story really hasn't been told.